I thought the silence meant I was, but silence is never. It listens first, and tonight something listened back. Sarah Mitchell had been standing in the basement of her inherited house for exactly 7, though it felt like the flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating stone walls that had witnessed more than a century of secret. She'd come down here looking for the circuit breaker, but something about the space held her captive, not fear exactly, but a peculiar awareness that made her skin prickle. The air tasted old, metallic, like pennies left too long in a pocket. She could hear her own breathing, each exhale visible in the October cold that seeped through the foundation. That's when she did it. That's when she whispered the words that would change everything. Don't trust the silence. She breathed into the darkness, her voice barely audible even to herself. It was something she'd always done. This habit of speaking her thoughts aloud when her ex-husband David used to mock her, calling it creepy, saying it made her seem Maybe he'd been right. Maybe that's why she was here, in this god-forsaken house in Ashford Hollow, Vermont, instead of in their comfortable Boston condo. The divorce papers were barely, the ink on her resignation letter from Thornwood Academy even fresher. 3 weeks ago, she'd been a respected English literature teacher with a marriage, a career, a life that made sense. Then came the letter from a lawyer she'd never met, informing her that her aunt Margaret, a woman she'd seen exactly twice in her childhood, had died and left her. Margaret Mitchell, eccentric, found deceased in her reading chair at age 70. Natural cause, the death certificate said. But Sarah had learned that natural causes was often just shorthand for we stopped asking questions. The silence pressed against. That's the thing about real silence. Weight. It has texture. It has presence. Sarah started to turn back toward the stairs when her own voice, her exact word, her precise intent. Don't trust the sun. The flashlight slipped from her finger, clattering against stone. The beam rolled, casting wild shadows that seemed to reach. Her heart hammered against her ribs so hard she thought they might crack. She stood frozen, every muscle locked, every nerve screamed. Be echo, because surely it was just an echo. Basements were notorious for strange acoustics, had come from somewhere behind, from the deepest corner where her flashlight beam hadn't yet penetrated. Sarah forced herself to breathe, in through the nose, out through the mouth, the way Dr. Chen had taught her during their telehealth session. Anxiety creates a pattern, he'd said. Your brain fills silent with noise when it's stressed. You're processing trauma. This is normal, but this felt like being watched by something that had been waiting a very long time for someone to speak. She retrieved her flashlight with trembling hand, the LED beam shaking as badly as her. The basement stretched before her, roughly 30 by 20, with a ceiling so low you could touch it if she reached up. Stone wall, dirt floor, wooden support beams that looked original to the 1890 structure. A few cardboard boxes stacked in one, an old furnace that probably hadn't worked in decades. Nothing explained the echo. Nothing that explained why her own words had come back with that slight delay. That 1 second gap that was too long for a natural reverberation, but too short for someone to have delivered. Unless someone had been waiting, breath held, ready to mirror her the instant. Sarah backed toward the stair, keeping her light trained on the dark. Her throat felt tight, her mouth dry. She wanted to call out, to demand who was there, but something primal stopped. Some instinct that predated language warned her that making more sound would be a mistake. The basement remained silent, perfect, absolute silent, and that silence felt like an answer. It felt like something holding its breath, waiting to see what Sarah climbed the stairs slowly, deliberate, refusing to run, even though every cell in her body screamed for flight. She reached the door, stepped through, and closed it behind her with a soft click that seemed deafening. Only then, standing in the kitchen with her back pressed against the door, did she let herself acknowledge the truth she'd been avoiding since the moment she arrived. She wasn't alone. She might never have. Sleep didn't come. Sarah lay in the second floor bed, the only one with furniture, brass bed frame that creaked with every breath. A dresser with a mirror she'd covered with a sheet because she couldn't stand seeing her own reflection in the dark. The house settled around her, wood contracting in the cold, pipes ticking as ancient plumbing adjusted to her present. Normal sound, explicable sound. Sounds, she told herself, were nothing more than an old structure doing what old structure. But she listened differently. Every creak became a footstep. Every whisper of wind through gaps in the window frame became breath. The heating system kicked on at 2:17, and she nearly screamed. By 3:30, she'd given up pretending. She sat up, switched on the bedside lamp, and pulled out her laptop. If she couldn't sleep, she could at least understand what had happened. She started with a logical explanation. Basement, echo chamber, standing wave. She found articles about how certain architectural configurations could create bizarre auditory phenomena, where whispers traveled along walls, spaces where sound reflected in impossible ways. The Whispering Gallery in St. Paul's, the Echo Wall at the Temple of Heaven in Beijing. Perfectly rational, scientifically documented, except those required specific curved wall, particular dimension, and they never according to every source she could find sound. With that kind of precision, they amplified, they carried, they distorted, they didn't mirror. Her search history grew desperate as dawn approached. Auditory hallucination, stress-induced psychosis, grief manifestation. She'd lost her marriage, her career, her entire sense of identity span of 6. Dr. Chen would say she was manufacturing experience to externalize into creating a threat she could potentially, unlike the emotional devastation she couldn't outrun. It made sense. It was reason. It was probably, but it didn't explain the recording. At 4:45 a.m., Sarah made. She opened the voice memo app on her phone, checked the recording quality setting, and steeled herself for what she's about. If this was real, she needed proof. If it was psychosis, she needed to know that. Either way, she needed evidence that existed outside her own unreliable perception. The basement door looked different pre-dawn dark, more solid, more like something that shouldn't be open, like a boundary that was stay sealed. Sarah gripped her phone in one hand, flashlight in the other, and descended. The stairs groaned under her weight, announcing her arrival to whatever waited below. The cold hit her immediately, more intense than she remembered, as if the temperature dropped 20. Her breath came out in thick cloud. The stone walls glistened with condensation that hadn't been there before. Or maybe it had, and she'd been too terrified. She positioned herself in the center of the basement, exactly where she'd stood the previous. She activated the voice memo app, watching the red recording indicator pulse her heart. Then she waited, letting 30 seconds of silence occur, establishing a base. Her finger hovered over the screen. This was it. The moment that would either confirm her sanity or shatter it. She raised her head, stared into the darkest corner, and whispered clearly into the phone. I know. The words hung. 1 second, 2, 3. Sarah's hand shook so badly the phone nearly slipped from her grip. Nothing, just the ambient hum of her own fear, the rush of blood in her ear. The I know. Her body went rigid. The voice came from the exact same corner, with the exact same inflection, the exact same cadence. But this time she was ready. This time she was recording. She pressed stop on the voice memo, her hands trembling so violently she almost dropped the phone. She didn't wait. She didn't investigate. She ran up the stair, through the kitchen, into the living room, where the first rays of sunlight were beginning to penetrate the dust. Only there, in the growing light, did she dare to play back. She pressed play, volume. Her whisper came through clearly. I know you're there. Then silent. 5 seconds, 10, 50, nothing. No response, no echo, just her own voice, and then empty. Sarah played it again, and again, and again. Each time, the same. Her words captured perfectly the response she'd heard so clearly, so undeniably didn't. The phone hadn't recorded, which meant either the phenomenon was somehow immune to electronic documentation, or she'd imagined the whole. She stared at the screen, at the waveform that showed only her voice, only her sound. A laugh bubbled up from somewhere deep in her chest, edged with hysteria. This was it. This was how it started. The slow unraveling, the gentle dissolution of certainty, the creeping awareness that her own mind couldn't be trusted. But then she noticed, in the waveform, right where the response should have been, there was a spot, barely visible, easy to miss. A tiny fluctuation in the ambient sound, lasting less than a second. She zoomed in, expanding the waveform until that moment filled. There it was. Something had made a sound, too quiet for her to hear on playback, but present, a disturbance in the silence, a whisper the phone could sense, but couldn't quite capture. Sarah sat on the floor, back against the phone, clutched to her chest, and watched the sun rise through windows that hadn't been cleaned. She had her evidence, and it was worse than either confirmation or denial. It was ambiguity. It was possibility. It was the door opening to a reality where nothing was certain, where silence had texture, where being alone was no longer a guarantee. Eleanor Vance appeared at Sarah's door at exactly 9 a.m., carrying a casserole and a faded floral. She was the kind of elderly woman who seemed constructed in New England itself sharp. Silver hair pulled back in a severe bun, eyes the color of winter sky. She wore a cardigan despite the cold, as if temperature was something that happened to others. Sarah hadn't hadn't even known she existed until the woman knocked 3 precise raps that somehow felt like a summons rather. When Sarah opened the door, Eleanor's gazed past, scanning the interior of the house with an expression that mixed nostalgia and something dark, dread, or recognition. The casserole turned out to be chicken and rice, still warm, seasoned with herbs Sarah couldn't identify. They sat at the kitchen table, the only piece of furniture downstairs besides a threadbare couch, and Eleanor poured coffee from a thermos she'd brought without asking if Sarah wanted. The presumption should have been annoying. Instead, it felt oddly comforting, as if someone had finally taken charge of a situation Sarah no longer understood how to. They made small talk for exactly 4 minutes. Whether, the condition of the road, the upcoming town harvest festival. Then Eleanor set down her coffee and said, "You've heard it, haven't you?" The house talking back. Sarah's hand froze halfway. The coffee suddenly tasted like she wanted to deny, to laugh it off, to protect herself behind the wall of rational skepticism she'd been building storm. But something in Eleanor's face, a terrible knowing, a weary familiarity made lying point. She nodded. Just one. Eleanor closed her eyes for a long moment, and when she opened them again, they glistened with tears she refused full. My sister Catherine, from 1992 to 1995. She was the one who found it first, the spot in the basement where sound behaves. She was a physicist, studied acoustic phenomena, thought she could understand it, document, maybe even explain it. Sarah leaned forward. What happened? The question hung between them, heavy with implication. Eleanor's jaw tightened. She disappeared. March 14th, 1995. No body. No evidence of foul. The police searched for months. I searched for a year. She pulled a folded photograph from her cardigan pocket. smoothed it on the table. A woman in her late 30s, dark hair, bright smile, standing in front of this very. The last time I spoke to her, she said something strange. She said the echoes were learning, that they came back faster each time, more precise, like something was studying the pattern. She stopped, started writing everything down instead of speaking. Eleanor's finger traced the edge of the photograph. The day she vanished, I found her note. The last entry said, "It knows. It can say it before I." Cold spread through Sarah's chest. A frost that had nothing to do with the temperature. Before could say it. That's not possible. That's not how sound. Eleanor's laugh was bitter, sharp-headed. Sound. You think this is about sound. She stood abruptly, walked to the basement door, placed her palm flat against like she was feeling. This house sits on something. A place where the walls between thought and voice are thin, where intention becomes manifest, where loneliness opens doors should stay closed. She turned back to Sarah. My sister wasn't the first. Your Aunt Margaret wasn't the last. There have been others, all of them alone, all of them talking, filling silence with their own voices until something else learned to fill it. Sarah's mouth had gone. Why are you telling me? Eleanor returned to the table, gathered her thermos, her empty casserole. Because you haven't run. That means either you're braver than the other, or more broken. Either way, you deserve to know what you're dealing. At the door, she paused. One more thing. Catherine's last recording. The police gave it to me after they closed. It's 3 minutes of silence. But if you turn the volume all the way up, amplify it beyond normal range, you can hear something underneath. A voice. Her voice, saying words she never spoke, in conversations she never had, living a life that happened in the spaces between sound. She met Sarah's eyes direct. The echoes don't just repeat, they replace, and they'll wait as long. Then Eleanor Vance walked down the porch steps and disappeared into the morning, leaving Sarah alone with a truth that felt like a sentence. In the silence that followed, Sarah could swear she heard something, not a voice, not an echo, just the subtle sense present, like someone taking a breath, preparing to speak. Sarah spent the next 48 hours in absolute silence. Not voluntary silence, strategic silence. She communicated only through text, typed notes on her laptop, hand gestured to the delivery driver who brought grocery line. She wore noise-canceling headphones constantly, even to sleep, flooding her ears with white noise to drown out any possibility of ambient. If she didn't speak, it couldn't respond. If she didn't give it her voice, it couldn't learn. Simple, logical, completely unsustainable. By the third day, the isolation was eating her. She'd always been comfortable, preferred it even. But this was different. This wasn't solitude, it was erasure. She was disappearing into silence, becoming a ghost in her own. Her telehealth session with Dr. Chen broke her resolve. She'd been typing responses to his questions for 20 minutes when he finally said, "Sarah, I need this isn't sustainable. Whatever you're afraid of, avoiding speech entirely isn't the answer." She stared at the screen, at his concerned face, at the chat box where she'd been frantically typing explanations that sounded insane even. Her fingers hovered over the key. Then, deliberate, she removed the headphone. The silence of the house rushed in like water, filling every space, pressing against her. She took a breath, opened her mouth, and spoke. "I think I'm losing my mind." Her voice sounded foreign after days of rough and uncertain. Dr. Chen leaned closer. "That's a start. Tell me what's been happening." She did. All of it. Her basement. The whisper. Eleanor's story. The recording that showed almost nothing but proved something had been. She watched his expression shift from concern to clinical evaluation. Saw him making notes she couldn't see. When she finished, he was quiet for a long. Then he said gently, "Sarah, grief and trauma can manifest in very physical. What you're experiencing could be a form of dissociate from somewhere. Her own voice interrupted. Dissociate disorder. Yes, I know. Sarah's blood turned to ice. Dr. Chen stopped mid-sentence, confused. I didn't finish that. How did you? But Sarah wasn't listening. She was staring at the doorway to the hall, where her voice had come from. Not. The words had arrived before Dr. Chen could say them, finishing his sentence perfect. It had anticipated. It had known what he would say before the words left, which meant it wasn't just repeat. It was learning from every voice, every conversation, every sound, growing, evolving, becoming something that understood language at a level that transcended simple. Sarah looked back at the screen. Dr. Chen's face had gone pale. Sarah, I heard that through your microphone. I heard your voice, but you didn't. What the hell is in that house? She opened her mouth to answer, but before she could form word, the response came from the darkness behind, in her exact, speaking the thought she'd only begun to think. Something that's been waiting a very long time to not be alone. Dr. Chen immediately urged Sarah to leave. Call the police. Get to a hotel. Anywhere but there. But when she tried, her car didn't start. The battery was dead despite being. Her phone lost signal the moment she stepped off the porch. Even her legs seemed a profound exhaustion settling into her bones that made each step toward escape feel like waiting. The house wanted her, or something in it. Deputy James Kowalski arrived 3 hours after Dr. Chen had called every emergency service in the county till someone agreed to do a wellness. Kowalski was in his early 40s, with the weathered face of someone who'd seen enough to stop being surprised, but not enough to stop caring. He listened to Sarah's story with an expression that shifted from skepticism to recognition to something that looked like resignation. When she finished, he pulled out a worn notebook from his jacket pocket, the kind detectives carry in movies, filled with details that never made it official. He flipped to a page dated 15 years, October 20. My partner, Detective Marcus Webb, investigated a disturbance address. Homeowner claimed someone was in the house, mimicking, following him. We found nothing. 2 weeks later, Marcus came back alone to do a follow-up. Kowalski's hand tightened. He went into the basement and never came out. I found his radio down there, still transmitting silent. When I played back the recording, I heard him calling for her, but the time stamp showed he made that call 30 minutes after I'd already found. Sarah felt dizzy. What are you saying? Kowalski met her eyes. I'm saying this house collects voices, and once it has yours, it can use it whenever it wants, however it wants. Marcus didn't disappear. He got stuck between speaking and being heard, between sound and silence. He stood abruptly, walked to the window, looked out at the darkening. Eleanor sent me. She thought you should know. You're not crazy, and you're not. There are others who know this place. We've been trying to document, understand it, maybe find a way to stop it. But every time we get close, someone else vanished. Sarah's voice came out as a whisper. What do I do? Before Kowalski could answer, every light in the house went out simultaneously. In the darkness, Sarah heard breathing. Not her, not Kowalski. Multiple breaths, overlapping, coming from every direction. Then, in perfect unison, a dozen voices spoke cold, all saying the same thing she was thinking, but hadn't. I want to leave, but I can't. Kowalski pulled his flashlight, the beam cutting through darkness that seemed almost solid. The basement, he said, urgent. We need to go down there now. Eleanor found something in Catherine's researcher way to break the pattern, but it requires confronting at the... Sarah's entire body screamed in protest. Every instinct told her that going into that basement now, in the dark, with this thing fully awake and aware was sued. But staying up here, trapped in a house that was learning to think with her thoughts and speak with her voice, was a different kind, a slower dissolution, an erasure that would leave her body intact but herself completely gone. She looked at Kowalski, saw the same terror in his eyes that she felt, and understood that he was choosing to face, not because he was brave, but because he'd lost someone to it and refused to lose. "Okay," she said, and from the basement below, her own voice echoed back, eager, "Okay." The basement stair creaked under their weight. Each step an announcement of their descent into something that had been waiting decades for this moment. Kowalski's flashlight beam trembled despite his steady hand. Sarah followed close behind, her own light crossing, creating shadows that seemed to move purpose. At the bottom, the cold was absolute. Not the chill of autumn, but the cold of space where warmth had been extracted and replaced with something. The air tasted different, too metallic and old, like breathing in memories of voices long. Kowalski pulled a small speaker's jacket, the kind used for phone calls, and placed it in the center. Catherine's research said the phenomenon feeds on isolated voices, single sources of sound with no one to receive. But if we flood it with noise, with multiple overlapping voices, it might destabilize the pattern. Sarah understood immediately. We overload it, break its ability to focus, to learn, to replicate. He nodded, pulling out his phone, queuing up a playlist. On 3, we both speak, continue, different, and we don't stop, no matter what. We're back. Sarah's heart hammered. This was it. Either they broke the pattern, or they became part of it. She thought of Catherine, of Margaret, of her aunt Margaret, the voices this place, trapped in the space between speaking and being heard. She opened her mouth, ready to, when every light died simultaneously. Both flashlight, Kowalski's phones, even the faint luminescence from the stairs above vanished, as if darkness itself had become. In that absolute black, Sarah heard it. Not one voice, not a dozen, 100, 1,000, every person who'd ever witnessed. Their voices layered and overlapping, creating a sound like static, made of scream, prayer, and last. And underneath it all, a silence so profound it had intention, had hunger. Now, Kowalski shouted and pressed. Music erupted from the speaker, chaotic. He began speaking over, reciting what sounded like poetry, his voice loud and deliberate. Sarah joined him, yelling the first thing that came to mind, Shakespeare, the opening of Hamlet, Who's There? Words about God and ghosts and voices in the dark. The cacophony was immediate and overwhelming. The basement filled with sound that had structure, had source, had destination. And for the first time since Sarah had arrived, the echo didn't. Instead, something else happened. The darkness began to scream, not with voice, but with pressure, with the feeling of something vast and ancient being forced to release what it had held. Sarah felt it in her bone, in her teeth, in the spaces behind her eye. The basement itself seemed to vibrate, stone walls humming with frequencies that shouldn't. Then, like a bubble burst, it stopped. Light returned not from their device, but from the basement itself, a pale phosphorescence that seemed to come from everywhere. And in that light, Sarah saw them, translucent figures, dozen, standing in the space where sound trapped. Catherine, Margaret, others she didn't recognize. All of them with mouths open, frozen mid-word, finally able to complete the sentence that had been interrupted by silence. One by one, they spoke their last word, their voices finding destination at last, and dissolved like breath in winter. The basement returned to normal, just stone and dirt and old furniture. No cold, no pressure, no present. Kowalski sat heavily on the stair, exhausted. Sarah stood in the center where she'd first whispered her warning, and felt only empty. Good empty. The kind that comes after something terrible. 6 months later, Sarah sat in a Boston coffee shop, surrounded by conversation and life. and the beautiful chaos of voice overlap. She'd sold the house. The county had demolished, officially citing structure. Eleanor had thanked her with tears in her eyes, finally able to let her sister rest. Sarah pulled out her phone, opened her voice memo app, and recorded a message. Not to anyone, just words sent into a world where someone would hear them, where silence was filled connection instead. I thought the silence meant I was, she said softly. But I was. Silence just means someone hasn't spoken. And now I know between being alone and being, between isolation and solitude, between a voice in the void and a voice that finds its way. She stopped recording and played it back. Just her voice. No echo, no response. Perfect.